Welcome back, everyone. It's time to get started on our next big concept, and that is another very important sort of foundational, that's the reason why it's in this first section of basic economic concepts, a foundational concept that you would learn if you were in AP economics, general economics, whether it's microeconomics or macroeconomics, and that is the concept of comparative advantage and trade. Now, you may recall way back in the first section, we talked about sort of this economic way of thinking, sort of some of the basic underlying assumptions that we move forward with when learning economics and when learning to think like economists think. And one of those was that we engage in transactions that are going to benefit us and that we benefit from trade and from those transactions. So that's kind of what we're going to be getting in a little bit today, is talking about those concepts and why is it that we benefit from trading with each other? Why is it that we do benefit from not producing everything on our own? Why are we better off and more efficient and able to get more of what we want and better able to satisfy those unlimited wants with limited resources if we are engaging in trade with others? So we're going to start with just a couple of very, very simple terms here. And again, a lot of these are words that you'll be like, really? How's that even a vocabulary term? But we have to define it kind of a little bit more specifically, a little bit more textbook style, and particularly in specific reference to economics, because sometimes some of these words might have a bit more of a specific definition when looked at through the eyes of an economist or through the lens of economics or something like that. So we are going to be getting in just a moment to the concept of trade, and we probably all have a very basic understanding of what trade is, giving something for something else. I'll trade what I've got in exchange for something that you have, and that's what it is. It is providing goods and services to others in exchange for goods and services in return. And there's a reason why we do that. There's specific reasons why that benefits us. And yeah, we can explain that just in layman's terms. If this person has something that I don't, and I've got something that they don't have, it makes sense to trade. And what we receive from that is what we call gains from trade, what economists call gains from trade. And it's simply the principle that through trade and when we trade, we're better able to specialize, we're better able to focus on those things that we are particularly good at doing. And this is how we become more efficient. And this is a key to getting us a better standard of living. We're able to get more things. We're able to utilize our time better. We're able to do more of the things that we want to do the things that we're better at doing. If we are able to trade, we receive those gains from trade. And now I just said that one of the reasons why we want those gains from trade is because we're able to specialize and get more of what you want. So let's talk about what specialization means. Specialization means, just like what it sounds, being able to focus on doing that thing or engaging in that practice or producing that good or whatever that you're good at, the one that you have the best skills for, the one that you can do the most efficiently. This is kind of like when we were doing the PPC, we talked about that law of increasing opportunity costs and how that happens because, those workers, eventually, if you're going to put more workers into making good A, you got to pull them away from good B. Maybe those workers were better suited. They were better at specializing in good B, and thus the higher opportunity costs. And when different people engage in different practices and producing different goods and whatever, that enhances our ability to get more of what we want. And we're going to see that all worked out here, even mathematically, when we get to these concepts of comparative advantage and trade. So let's talk about this concept of comparative advantage and something kind of that goes along with it, absolute advantage. And this is where economists, we should just go ahead and say, economists generally, almost all of them, and they have different political leanings, but none of this is meant to be political. We're not getting political here. But most economists agree that trade is a good thing. Sometimes trade gets a bad reputation of why are we trading with countries instead of making things ourselves. And I think you'll see with this particular concept how that's not always a good idea. That's sometimes something that's very popular to say, and it can be something that kind of whips people into a frenzy. But when you look at it from the standpoint of an economist and we look at it mathematically, we'll see how trade really does benefit us a lot of the time. So the very, very concept of trade has to do with this concept of comparative advantage. Comparative advantage means that you have the advantage in producing something. If you have the comparative advantage, whether you're an individual person or you're talking about a country or you're talking about a company, whatever it is, if they have comparative advantage in something, that means that they have the advantage in producing it because they can produce it at a lower opportunity cost. That's the key phrase right there. They can produce it at a lower opportunity cost. Their opportunity cost to produce good A is lower than the opportunity cost of this other country, this other nation. If I have comparative advantage in producing something, I have to give up less of other things in order to do that than my neighbor or my rival or whatever. So because of that comparative advantage, it is not as costly because the opportunity cost is smaller, and therefore that would suggest that I should specialize in producing that thing by which I have comparative advantage over. Now, the other concept about advantage is what we call absolute advantage. Absolute advantage means that you have the advantage and that you can simply produce more. Whether you're a country, whether you're an individual or a firm or whatever, if you have the absolute advantage, that means that you can simply produce more of a product than your rival or this other country or what have you. So think about it as kind of like absolute value, how that's just the number without anything else attached to it. Comparative or absolute advantages, we just look at, how many of good A can this country produce, can that country produce? Whoever can produce the most has the absolute advantage. That simply means they can produce the most. That may not mean that they can produce it at a lower opportunity cost. So it is quite possible that whoever has absolute advantage could have comparative advantage, but it is also very possible that whoever has the absolute advantage may not have the comparative advantage, in which it would actually benefit them to trade for that thing that they don't have the comparative advantage in. So comparative advantage is the basis for mutual gain. That is kind of the basis of which trade will come from and what we're going to trade for, those things that we don't have a comparative advantage in producing. So we need to learn then, what we're going to do next is talk about how to calculate comparative advantage. How do we figure out? Absolute advantage is easy. We just look and see who's got the bigger number. But comparative advantage is a little bit trickier, involves a little tiny bit of math. If comparative advantage is determining who has the lower opportunity costs, then that must mean in order to figure out who's got comparative advantage, got to be able to figure out opportunity costs. So that's what I'm going to show you next. So the formula for learning comparative advantage, there are a couple of formulas in microeconomics or just economics that you just got to learn. This is one of them. So to find comparative advantage, we got to calculate the opportunity cost. There are two different ways to do this depending on the nature of the problem. Majority of the time, you're going to use this formula right here in what we call the output formula for comparative advantage. It's an output problem. Output problem means that the question is phrasing everything in terms of output. What can be produced? Country A can produce 10 tons of grain and 5 tons of beef, and the other country can produce this much. Output is talking about what can they produce, okay? And that means that the inputs are not what we're worried about. It's what they are producing. The majority of the time, the problems that you will deal with will be output problems. And so this is the one that you're probably going to use 90% of the time. And it simply works like this. The opportunity cost of good A equals B over A. And the opportunity cost of good B would be A over B. So the one that you are looking for, the opportunity cost of the particular good or service that you are looking for goes on the bottom. And then the other one would go on the top. If it's an input problem, then you flip that around. Input means it's a question about not how much corn and how much pizza a nation can produce, but how long it takes them to do it. Or they can do it with 10 units of labor or 5 units of labor. It has to do with the inputs that are going into making that product. So if it's asking about how many hours it takes them, how many workers it takes them, how many factories they're going to need, how many machines they can do it with, if it has to do with the inputs, how much it takes to make good X, then you just flip it around. And the opportunity cost of good A would be A over B, and the opportunity cost of B or whatever you're talking about would be B over A. So if it's input, the number of the good that you're looking for goes on the top. If it's output, that number goes on the bottom. So that's how you find opportunity costs. And then you're looking to see who has the smaller opportunity costs, which you need to memorize those formulas, right? Pointing the wrong way. You need to memorize those formulas. You need to know that. Again, most of the time it's going to be output, but you need to know what input looks like as well. So the best way to learn this is by doing it. A lot of this probably doesn't make a ton of sense right now, or maybe make about 20% sense, but it makes a lot more when you actually work it out. So let's take a look at this. And I'm going to try out some different tech things while we work this. So bear with me as I try to do that. I'm going to try to draw on some stuff here in a second. Okay, so this example, and this utilizes the similar example that was used in the earlier, the PPC, the same about the guy on the deserted island. Doesn't really matter what it's all about. But I have these two different PPCs for Tom and for Hank. Get it? Haha. And the two things that they can each produce. They can each produce coconuts and fish. We saw this example in the last section. According to this PPC, Tom can produce as many as 30 coconuts, in which he wouldn't be producing any fish, or 40 fish and as many as 30 coconuts. Okay, now don't worry about what's in the green here right now. And then his buddy over here, Hank, can produce as many as 20 and as many as 10. So we're going to calculate the opportunity cost. Before we do that, let's figure out absolute advantage. Absolute advantage means who can simply produce the most. Well, for coconuts, that would be Tom, because he can produce 30 as compared to Hank's 20. And for fish, it would also be Tom, because he can produce 40 next to Hank's 10. So he has an absolute advantage in both of those things, which is possible, but he will not have comparative advantage in both things. It's possible to have absolute advantage in both items. It is never possible to have comparative advantage in both. So what we're going to do now is calculate the opportunity cost using the formula that I just showed you. I'm going to switch over to a different platform here so I can actually draw on this. We're going to see how this works. Okay. So and this is an output problem, and if I'm looking down, I'm looking at my Chromebook here. If this is an output problem, then that means that the opportunity cost, let's start with Tom. So I'm going to say that this is Tom. Let me get my pen going. And I'm looking at his opportunity cost of coconuts. There's a little bit of delay between what I'm putting here and what you're going to see, so sorry about that. So his opportunity cost for coconuts, I'm just going to abbreviate that right there. Okay, so opportunity cost of A, that's coconuts, is B over A. Well, he can produce either 30 coconuts or 40 fish. So the coconuts are the A. So we're going to do 40 over 30. That reduces down to 4/3. So his opportunity cost of a coconut is 4/3 of a fish. Every coconut he gathers costs him 4/3 of a fish that he now can't gather because he's gathered, or catch, or whatever, because he's gathering coconuts. Okay, let's do the same thing for fish. Opportunity cost of A, in this case is fish, is B, 30 over A, which is 40, 3/4. Okay, so his opportunity cost of a fish is 3/4 or 3/4 of a coconut. Okay, every time he catches a fish, he's giving up 3/4 of a coconut that he can't catch or can't gather because he's catching fish. Okay, so now for the other fella, here's Hank. Let's look at his. So for a coconut for him, here's coconuts. That'll be A. It's going to be B, which is 10 over A. 10 over 20, which is 1/2. So his opportunity cost of gathering a coconut is half of a fish. And for fish, okay, it's 20 over 10, which is 2. Okay, so that means that his opportunity cost of a fish is 2 coconuts. Now we said that Tom had the advantage, or the absolute advantage, in both items. But if we look, we'll see that somebody has a comparative advantage in one and somebody has a comparative advantage in the other. Tom's opportunity cost of getting a coconut is 4/3. Hank's is 1/2. So who has comparative advantage here? Hank does, because it only costs him half of a fish, whereas it costs Tom 4/3 of one, or 1 1/3, which is a lot more. But if we look at the fish, who has comparative advantage there? Well, Tom does, because it costs him 3/4 of a coconut, whereas it costs Hank over here too. So again, while Tom has absolute advantage in both things, he only has the comparative advantage in fish. All right, so let's go back over here. Hopefully that helps that make sense a little bit more. Get started. So once again, there are our numbers, meaning that for the fish, Tom has the comparative advantage because it only costs him 3/4 of a coconut. For the coconuts, Hank has the advantage because it only costs him half of a fish. So when it comes to what they should trade for and what they should produce on their own, Tom has the absolute advantage in both fish and coconuts because he can produce more. When we look at those numbers, he can produce more. But Tom's got the comparative advantage. That means that these two would benefit from trade, with Tom producing fish and Hank producing coconuts. They would both get more of what they want if they would do that. I'm going to show you a chart that explains how that might work. Okay, so over here, I'm going to get my laser pointer going because you'll see it better. Okay, now one thing, let me call your attention. Let me go back just a minute and show you one quick thing. Okay, here we were assuming that they weren't trading, and so they were producing at this point on their PPC. So that's where some of these, I just want to show you where some of these numbers came from. And this was not figured out by some formula. They just decided this is where they were. So before trade, we're saying that Tom was here producing 9 coconuts and 28 fish, and before trade, Hank was here producing 8 coconuts and 6 fish. Okay, you just need to know that to move on to look at this chart and know where these numbers come from, what this is talking about. Okay. So without trade, that's what this is showing. Without trade, Tom was producing his 28 fish and 9 coconuts, and he was consuming 28 fish and 9 coconuts because he wasn't trading with anybody. So he was keeping all of that for himself. And before trade, Hank was producing 6 and 8, and he was keeping 6 and 8. He wasn't trading with anybody. Okay. Well, now Tom is going to specialize in the production of coconuts. We know that if he just does that and utilizes all of his resources to just produce coconuts, he can produce as many as 40. That means fish. He can produce 40 fish. He can catch 40 fish. He's not going to produce any coconuts because he's going to specialize in fish. Same thing for Hank. He's not going to catch any fish because he's going to be busy focusing on coconuts. And we saw from his PPC on the previous slide that he can produce 20 of them. Now let's assume that he is going to consume, going back up to Tom here, he can produce 40. Let's assume he's going to consume 30 of them. That leaves 10 for him to trade because he's going to make 40 total. Let's say he's going to keep 30 of them for himself. He's going to give 10 of them. That's where this 10 comes from. 10 to his friend over here. Okay, and then he's going to use all of his time producing the coconuts. He's going to keep 10 of them for himself. He's going to trade 10 of them up here to his buddy Tom. So that's where all these numbers come from. And if you can see the numbers here would show you gains from trade. What it's showing you is, okay, if he wasn't trading, let's just look at Tom for an example. He was producing 28 fish and 9 coconuts. Well, now he's got 40 and 10. So he did 12 more. He ended up with, 30, I'm sorry. He ended up with 2 more fish than he normally would have had. He ended up with 1 more coconut than he would have had. If we look at Hank's example, without trade, he could only get 6 fish. Well, now he can get 10 now that he's specializing in something else and getting 10 fish from Tom. He could get 8 coconuts before. Now he's going to get 10, so that's a gain of 2. So you see that they're both better off and able to produce more and able to consume more, get more of what they want if they trade with each other. Okay, and this just shows that same thing on the production possibilities curve. So this is where they were, but with trade, they're able to be out here. They can expand it and do even better. So what we end up with, again, is this concept that overall we benefit from trade, and international trade results from comparative advantage because we have comparative advantage in some things and not comparative advantage in others. And so this is why we engage in that trade. And most economists, again, would argue that trade is a positive thing, that trade is a good thing because of that concept of comparative advantage. they might argue that, okay, some people complain or say that it's bad that so many things are produced overseas. Why don't we produce that in America? But that overlooks the opportunity cost. Labor is a lot more expensive in the United States. That would make the price of the products go up, and we wouldn't be able to consume as many as we do. We wouldn't be able to buy as many cell phones and TVs and cars and such if the price of them goes up, because the costs are so much higher for producing those things here. So, just because you can produce something doesn't always mean that you have the comparative advantage to do so. Now, once again, this is a concept that you learn by doing. So what we're going to do now is go through a couple of practice problems. I'm going to encourage you very, very strongly to pause the video. I'm going to put up these problems. I want you to pause the video and then start it back up when you think you have your answer and go through it with me as I go over the answer. So here's a practice problem for you to work. We have Japan and Canada. They can either make CDs or they can produce beef. So figure out for me who has the absolute advantage in producing CDs and producing beef. That part's pretty easy. Pause the video and start it back up when you're ready. All right, so hopefully you had a chance to look at that. Absolute advantage is pretty easy. Let me get my pointer going here. Laser, there we go. Okay, so that simply means who can produce more. Well, that would be Canada with CDs because they can produce 6. That's bigger than 4. And it would also be Canada when it comes to pounds of beef because 6 is bigger than 2. So there you are. And again, absolute advantage is simply a matter of who can produce more. So there's that. Okay, now comparative advantage. So pause the video, find comparative advantage, which means you need to find opportunity costs and figure out who's got the lower opportunity cost. So take a moment to figure out that one. Okay, so hopefully you had a chance to take a look at that and figure out who's got the lower opportunity cost. So let's take a look. Okay, hopefully I was able to edit that over. I decided to change the way I was doing this because it was not working so hot on the Google slide. So this is the same information that I had on the easier to read chart that was on the slide. So this is our information for what Japan and Canada can each produce. So we're going to figure out the comparative advantage situation. So for Japan, so let's start with, all right, maybe we get on the right thing. There we go. So Japan, let's start with CDs. So for CDs, that's going to be the A. So their opportunity cost of A is going to be B, which is the beef. They can do 2 over 4, which equals 1/2. For beef, that's now A. So it's going to be B over A, which is 4 over 2, which equals 2. So their opportunity cost of producing a CD is 1/2 of a pound of beef, and their opportunity cost of producing a pound of beef is 2 CDs. Now for Canada, for CDs, okay, 6 and 6 equals 1, and this one's nice and easy. For beef, 6 over 6 is 1. Now, we saw that Canada had the absolute advantage in both of those items, but let's look at comparative advantage, lower opportunity cost. For CDs, well, Japan has the comparative advantage because they can produce it for 1/2 of a pound of beef, whereas for Canada, that's 1. But when it comes to beef, Canada has the comparative advantage because they can produce it for 1, let me get rid of this, 1 CD as opposed to 2. Okay, so that's how they have comparative advantage. So that's the answer to that. So which nation has a comparative advantage in producing CDs? That is going to be Japan. So let's go back over to this. This bell's ringing just like in school, huh? So Japan has that advantage. Which nation has comparative advantage in producing beef? That would be Canada. So should Japan specialize in CDs or in beef? Well, they should specialize in CDs because they have that comparative advantage over it. So again, you got to memorize that formula, but it's basically fractions. And let me just say, while there is a good bit of math in economics, it's not hard math. The arithmetic itself will not be hard. You'll always be given numbers that are easy to work with like this, because in the AP exam, you can't even use a calculator. So it's got to be stuff that's going to work out evenly. So you shouldn't be seeing things where you're having to like divide and add crazy numbers in your head. So just a word there is that it's not the arithmetic itself is not hard. It's remembering the formulas is, and remembering the logic behind it and what that math shows you, what it really shows you above anything else. So hopefully you'll get a chance to do some more practice with comparative and absolute advantage, and we will continue on from there. And I hope this made some sense. Let me know if you have questions. Happy to answer those. Looking forward to seeing you, even if it is just on the computer. Until next time, see you then.